We're moving in a more agile direction, Alan. This is about cultural reform. The words hung in the sterile air of Conference Room 3, smelling of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Brent Sullivan, all of 38 years old with a Wharton MBA and a suit that cost more than my first car, delivered the line without a flicker of irony. They thought firing me would be the end of the story. They were wrong. My name is Alan Cooper. I'm 55 years old. For 24 years, 8 months, and 12 days, I was the plant manager at the Sterling Chemical Facility in Northwood, Ohio. I knew every inch of that place. Every valve, every pipe, every permit, every last line of the code of federal regulations that governed our existence. I was the institutional memory of a place that made the precursors for everything from plastics to pharmaceuticals, and I was being optimized out of a job by a man who probably thought an MSDS sheet was a new kind of crypto. If you appreciate stories about corporate arrogance meeting the unyielding force of documented fact, hit that like button and subscribe right now. I've found there's a special kind of justice for people who believe rules are for everyone but them, and I'll be bringing you new stories every week. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next time the gavel comes down. The humiliation was staged for maximum effect. It wasn't a quiet chat in my office. It was a formal meeting. Brent had summoned me to the main conference room, the one with the big oak table and the view of the east parking lot. Sarah, from HR, was there, a woman I'd hired 15 years ago, now staring intently at her notepad, refusing to meet my eyes. Alan, your tenure here has been substantial, Brent began, leaning back in his chair. He had this habit of steepling his fingers, like a caricature of a CEO in a bad movie. But the board feels, and I concur, that our operational paradigm needs a fundamental shift. We need to be leaner, more aggressive in our pursuit of shareholder value. He spoke in a language of buzzwords, a dialect I had no patience for. I'd spent my career dealing in absolutes, parts per million, PSI ratings, effluent temperature, EPA compliance deadlines. His words were vapor. I just sat there, my hands resting on the table, my posture straight. I learned in the Army, long before Sterling, that you never let them see you flinch. Your approach to compliance, he continued, a slight smirk playing on his lips, while thorough, is frankly antiquated. It's a drag on profitability. We're spending millions over engineering processes that our competitors handle for a fraction of the cost. He gestured vaguely toward the window. We need to streamline. Cut the bureaucratic bloat. Bureaucratic bloat. He was talking about the triple redundant safety interlocks I'd designed for the chlorine storage tanks. He was talking about the quarterly groundwater monitoring wells I'd installed, which weren't technically required by law, but gave us a crucial early warning system. He was talking about 24 years without a single major EPA violation, a record unmatched in our industry. My life's work. Your position is being eliminated, he said, the words finally landing with the flat finality of a dropped wrench. Effective immediately. Sarah has your severance package. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal effects. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his Brioni suit. The meeting was over. It had lasted less than 4 minutes. 1 minute for every 6 years of my service. I looked at Sarah. She finally glanced up, her expression a miserable mix of pity and fear. I nodded once, a small, tight motion. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say to them. As the 2 security guards I'd known for a decade appeared at the door, their faces apologetic. I had one. Crystal clear thought. What Brent Sullivan, in his infinite MBA-certified wisdom, didn't understand was that the ground beneath his feet, right under that gleaming east parking lot he could see from his new office, held secrets. And I had the map. I started at Sterling Chemical in 1999 as a shift supervisor. I was 31, just out of the Army with a degree in chemical engineering I'd earned on the GI Bill. The plant was a mess back then. It was an old facility, built in the late 1950s, and it had been run into the ground by a succession of indifferent managers. Safety was an afterthought, and environmental compliance was a joke. Spills were mopped up with sawdust and tossed in the dumpster. Records were kept in greasy notebooks, if they were kept at all. The place was a ticking time bomb. I knew it. The old hands knew it. Corporate, a distant entity in a glass tower in Chicago, didn't seem to care as long as the product kept shipping. I spent my first 5 years just trying to stop the bleeding. I worked 70-hour weeks. I missed my daughter Sarah's first steps because I was personally supervising the replacement of a corroded acid transfer line at 3 a.m. I missed my 10th wedding anniversary because we had a minor anhydrous ammonia leak that I had to manage, staying on site for 36 straight hours until I was sure every valve was secure and every employee was accounted for. I didn't just manage the plant. I rebuilt it, system by system. I wrote the first real safety manuals it ever had. I designed the first proper lockdown and emergency response procedures. I lobbied, begged, and bullied corporate for the funds to upgrade our wastewater treatment facility, improving its efficiency by 60% and bringing our discharge levels to well below EPA mandates. By the time they made me plant manager in 2008, we were on our way to becoming a model facility. My value wasn't in a spreadsheet. It was in the quiet hum of a plant operating safely, in the absence of disaster. It was the 24 families in Northwood who had a parent come home from work every single night, without injury. Brent Sullivan arrived 11 months ago. He wasn't from our industry. He was a turnaround specialist, the son of a major shareholder. His resume was a list of companies he'd spent a year or two at, slashing budgets and headcounts before moving on, leaving the hollowed-out shell for someone else to deal with. He walked the floor once in his shiny Italian shoes, looking at the machinery with a kind of detached disdain. He saw everything as a line item on a budget. He saw me with my 24 years of experience and my insistence on doing things the right way as the biggest line item of all. He couldn't see the value I provided because that value, safety, compliance, stability, was invisible. It was the sound of the phone not ringing at 2 a.m. with news of a catastrophe. The secret weapon, the map to Brent's demise, had its origins back in 2007. The company was planning to expand the east parking lot to accommodate a new office wing. As the newly appointed head of operations, it was my job to review the site plans. That included digging through the archives, looking at the original blueprints from 1958. Deep in a dusty file cabinet, I found a set of drawings labeled Site Prep, East Quadrant. They were old, brittle, and hand-drawn. One area, roughly 100 by 100 foot square, was cross-hatched and marked with a simple, cryptic note: Fill zone, do not excavate. It bothered me. It wasn't on any of the official surveys. I went to find Walt Kowalski. Walt was 72 at the time, a retired maintenance foreman who'd started at the plant the day it opened. I found him in his garage, rebuilding the carburetor on a vintage Ford Falcon. Over lukewarm beers, I showed him the drawing. He held it up to the light, his thick glasses perched on his nose. He squinted, then let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said, tapping a tobacco-stained finger on the cross-hatched square. "That's the Boneyard." He told me the story. Back in the 60s, before the EPA, before OSHA, before anyone really knew or cared, waste disposal was simple. When you had a 55-gallon drum of used cleaning solvents or bad chemical batches, you just found a quiet corner of the property, dug a big pit with a backhoe, and rolled the barrels in. Then you covered it up and forgot about it. The Boneyard was the biggest one. Walt figured there were a few hundred drums down there, mostly tetrachloroethylene and other chlorinated solvents. Nasty stuff. The boss back then, Old Man Hemlock, he said it was cheaper than hauling it away, Walt recalled, taking a slow sip of his beer. He paved right over it for the first parking lot in '72. Said what you can't see can't hurt you. Before I left, Walt put a hand on my shoulder. "Alan," he said, his voice serious. Some things you keep a record of. For yourself. Just in case the day comes when someone needs to remember. I took his advice. The next week, I hired a geotechnical survey team, telling corporate it was a mandatory assessment for the new building's foundation. The invoice was for a subsurface strata analysis. Their ground-penetrating radar lit up like a Christmas tree over the exact spot Walt had pointed out. The report showed dozens of large cylindrical metal anomalies, buried approximately 15 feet down. I attached the radar scans to a copy of the old blueprint, wrote a detailed memorandum titled Historical Site Assessment, East Quadrant, Subsurface Anomalies, and filed the official copy deep within the plant's permanent environmental archives, a place I knew no corporate executive would ever look. I made one other copy. That copy went into a fireproof safe in the basement of my house, right next to my Army discharge papers and my daughter's birth certificate. My personal stakes were simple. My severance was a joke. 3 months' pay for 24 years of loyalty. Most of my retirement was tied up in sterling stock options that were now void. I had a mortgage on a modest house, a 2004 Ford F-150 with 180,000 miles on it, and a daughter, Emily, starting her junior year at Ohio State. Her tuition bill was due in 6 weeks. Firing me wasn't just an insult. It was an attack on my family's future. It was an attempt to erase me, and I do not erase easily. After security walked me to my truck, I didn't rage. I didn't speed off, tires squealing. I drove home at the speed limit. I went down to my basement, opened the safe, and took out the file. The paper was cool and heavy in my hands. The calm that settled over me was absolute. It wasn't anger anymore. It was purpose. This wasn't going to be a messy fight. It was going to be an operation. I spent the rest of the day on the phone. My first call was to a buddy from my Army days, a guy who went on to a long career in the Criminal Investigation Division. He gave me the name of a private investigator. My second call was to that investigator. My third call was to Frank Miller, a former EPA Regional Enforcement Director I'd worked with on a task force years ago. I didn't tell him everything, just that I might have some information he'd find interesting in the near future. He told me how to structure a formal whistleblower tip for maximum impact. Be specific, Alan, he'd said. Give them file numbers, dates, and chemical names. Make it so they can't ignore it. Brent, meanwhile, was making it easy for me. Believing he had already won, he became a caricature of the arrogant new boss. He sent out a company-wide memo, which a loyal former subordinate forwarded to my personal email within minutes of it being sent. The memo, titled The New Sterling Way, A Paradigm of Profitability, was a masterpiece of corporate hubris. It announced an immediate 40% reduction in the wastewater treatment budget. It canceled the bi-weekly maintenance schedule for the smokestack scrubbers, moving it to a quarterly as-needed basis. He called these synergistic efficiency gains. I called them blatant violations of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. He was creating a fresh paper trail of criminal negligence, and he was signing his name to it. My private investigator was worth every penny. For 2 weeks, he sat in a car across the street from the plant. He documented Brent's new BMW M5 arriving at 9:30 a.m. and leaving at 4 p.m. every day. He documented the new landscaping being installed around the corporate offices, a $50,000 expense, while critical maintenance was being deferred. Most importantly, he got photos of a third-party waste disposal company, a notoriously cheap one known for cutting corners, making a pickup at an odd hour. Their manifests were likely to be a work of fiction. I compiled everything into a single, devastating package. I had the historical evidence, the 1958 blueprint, Walt's story transcribed and notarized, and the 2007 ground-penetrating radar report. I had the current evidence, Brent's memo, the new maintenance schedules he'd signed off on, and photographic evidence of his operational changes. It was an ironclad narrative. It told a story of a company with a dark secret buried in its past, now being run by a man who was actively dismantling the very systems designed to prevent future disasters. I waited. Patience is a weapon the arrogant never possess. I needed Brent to cross a line he couldn't uncross. My source inside the plant, a young engineer I had mentored, gave me the signal. November 15th. It was the date the first scheduled scrubber maintenance under the old system was supposed to happen. He confirmed via a text message at 4:17 p.m. Maintenance officially skipped. Directive signed by BS this morning. Budget line zeroed out. That was the trigger. Brent had now moved from intention to action. He had knowingly and willfully violated the terms of the plant's operating permit. The next morning, November 16th, at 9 a.m. sharp, I made the call. I didn't call a generic hotline. I called the direct line for the Regional Director of Criminal Enforcement, the number Frank Miller had given me. I identified myself and stated my purpose clearly and calmly. I am filing a formal whistleblower complaint against Sterling Chemical of Northwood, Ohio, I began, my voice steady. I have evidence of willful and ongoing violations of the Clean Air Act, specifically 40 CFR Part 60, related to scrubber maintenance protocols. The directive was signed by the current plant manager, Brent Sullivan, on November 15th. I also have historical site documentation, including ground-penetrating radar surveys, indicating the presence of several hundred drums of undisclosed and improperly disposed hazardous waste, specifically tetrachloroethylene, buried under the east parking lot at the following grid coordinates. I read them out, digit by digit. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, then a single, satisfying sentence. Mr. Cooper, we'll be in touch. The execution of the plan was something I wouldn't see firsthand, and that made it even more perfect. My victory wasn't about a dramatic confrontation. It was about a system of rules and consequences that I had respected for 24 years, finally being brought to bear on those who disdained it. The day was Tuesday, December 5th. I knew from my investigator that Brent was hosting a delegation of potential investors. It was his big moment to showcase the new Sterling Way and the impressive, albeit fictional, cost savings he'd achieved. He was at his peak of confidence, walking the investors along the perimeter fence, pointing out his cosmetic improvements, and spouting jargon about lean manufacturing and shareholder value. At 10:32 a.m., the convoy arrived. It wasn't a single inspector in a Ford Taurus. It was 5 black SUVs with government plates. They rolled up to the main gate, lights flashing, but no sirens. Quiet, professional. Men and women in jackets, with EPA, Criminal Investigation Division, emblazoned on the back, stepped out. The lead agent, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, presented a federal warrant to the stunned security guard. Brent's tour came to an abrupt halt. He saw the commotion and strode over, his face a mask of annoyance. The annoyance turned to confusion, then to pale, slack-jawed shock as the agent handed him a copy of the warrant. The investors exchanged nervous glances. This was not part of the glossy presentation. As the EPA team swept past him and began to secure the administration building and seize records, the investors didn't even say goodbye. They just quietly got in their cars and left. Brent was left standing there, the warrant fluttering in his hand, his authority having evaporated in the space of 30 seconds. One team of agents went straight to the maintenance logs. Another went to the wastewater outflow point with sampling kits. And a third team, equipped with a truck-mounted ground-penetrating radar unit, drove directly to the east parking lot and began a systematic grid search, right over the executive parking spaces. I watched it all from my living room. A local news helicopter was circling the plant, broadcasting live. The images were beautiful in their brutal efficiency. The sight of that radar unit tracing the exact lines from my 2007 survey report was a quiet, profound vindication. My statement had already been made, not in a shouting match in a boardroom, but in a meticulously documented, 18-page federal complaint. The power shift was absolute, and I was miles away, drinking a cup of coffee. The room didn't hold its breath. The entire chemical industry in Ohio did. The aftermath was swift and total. The EPA found exactly what I told them they would find. The ground radar confirmed the Boneyard, and core samples revealed leaking drums of tetrachloroethylene, which had already begun to contaminate the soil. The maintenance logs, signed by Brent, proved a willful disregard for the Clean Air Act. The wastewater samples showed discharge levels, creeping back up toward illegal limits. Sterling Chemical's parent company, Unitex, threw Brent under the bus with breathtaking speed. He was fired that same afternoon via a curt phone call from the corporate counsel. But it was too late, because he had personally signed the directives and the falsified compliance reports for the past month. He was named as the primary responsible party in the EPA's criminal complaint. His Wharton MBA and his father's connections were useless against federal charges. His career wasn't just over, it was radioactive. The company was hit with an initial fine of $16.8 million for the violations, the largest environmental penalty in the state's history. But that was just the beginning. They were also on the hook for the full cost of the cleanup of the east parking lot. The initial estimate for excavation, removal of 274 drums, and soil remediation was $28 million. Unitex's stock plunged 35% in a single week, wiping out nearly $500 million in market value. The cost-cutting measure, designed to save a few $100,000 a year, ended up costing the company hundreds of millions. That was the poetic justice. The bureaucratic bloat I had championed would have seemed like a bargain. The enablers didn't escape. The two vice presidents at corporate who had championed Brent's hiring were forced to resign by the board in the wake of the stock collapse. Sarah from HR was laid off in the ensuing restructuring. She sent me a one-line email. "I'm sorry." I never replied. Brent Sullivan pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of violating the Clean Air Act and submitting false documentation. He avoided prison time, but was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and a personal fine of $250,000. He was also permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any company in the chemical manufacturing industry. I read later that he was working as a logistics consultant for his brother-in-law's flooring company, from a Brioni suit to laminate flooring. And me? 4 months later, a check arrived via registered mail from the U.S. Treasury Department. It was my award from the EPA's whistleblower program. It was for 15% of the initial fine collected. The check was for $2,520,000. It was more money than I had earned in the previous 20 years combined. The first thing I did was pay off my mortgage. The second was to write a check for the entire remainder of Emily's college tuition, including her graduate school. The third was to buy a new engine and transmission for my 2004 F-150. Some things are worth keeping. With the remaining money, I started Cooper Compliance and Safety Consulting. My reputation in the industry was now legendary. I was the guy who knew where the bodies were buried, literally. My first clients were 3 of Sterling's biggest competitors. They were terrified. They hired me to perform the same kind of top-to-bottom audits I used to do for free for my old employer. My business was a success from day one. I set my own hours. I never missed another family dinner. I drove past the old plant a few months ago. The entire east parking lot was gone, replaced by a massive, open pit surrounded by chain-link fences. It was an ugly, expensive scar, a monument to arrogance. Men in hazmat suits were carefully excavating the poisoned earth, barrel by rusty barrel. They had called my diligence a cost. They found out the true price of cutting corners. My 24 years of meticulous work, of late nights and missed moments, hadn't been erased. It had simply been waiting, documented and filed, for the right moment to be seen. Truth has a way of working its way to the surface, even if you pave over it. For For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of profound peace. My work was done. Justice had been served. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hit that like button, leave a comment letting me know what you think, and if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe.